Everyone has a different communication style. Some stakeholders will prefer an email, some will prefer a message. Others will want that one-on-one. Now, what you can't control is their preferences, but what you do have control over is how you go about adapting your style to theirs. So let's now take a look at some of the common traps I often observe product managers falling into when it comes to stakeholder management. I've coached hundreds of product managers around the world, and I've worked with dozens of clients, companies all over the globe as well, from different shapes and sizes, from small startups to medium enterprises, all the way to large enterprises, and in all kinds of industries. And the common stakeholder management traps that I see product managers make are the following. The first one is that they don't know who their stakeholders are. Many also don't have a stakeholder engagement plan. Another common trap is to have too many one-on-ones, neglecting important stakeholders, so focusing only on a few and not tackling the really important ones. That also goes to treating all stakeholders equally or the same, being too internally focused, forgetting those suppliers and those other stakeholders, inadequate understanding of stakeholders' risks and concern, failing to build rapport first and a right foundation for things to grow, misaligned communication, and finally failing to bring those stakeholders in early. We're going to dive into each of these, but I wanted to just kind of rattle off the list. We'll dive into each of these now in detail and talk about how you can go about avoiding those mistakes. So the first mistake is simply not spending enough time to identify your stakeholders correctly. This results in either missing out on key stakeholders or not being able to properly put effective stakeholder engagement strategies together because you're missing those key people. Without properly identifying who your stakeholders are, you're essentially running blind when it comes to stakeholder management. This is going to be the first step in the following chapters that we will tackle, and we'll talk about how you can actually go about to identify and map out your stakeholders effectively. Now, the first trap being not identifying your stakeholders. The second one is actually not creating a deliberate strategy in how you intend to engage with them. Whether we like it or not all stakeholders are created equally, and as a result, we need to be deliberate about how we go about engaging and keeping our different stakeholders informed. Having a blanket approach for all your stakeholders may work in the short term, but it won't work in the long run. Things will start to come undone, friction will eventually form, and some stakeholders will be happy and some stakeholders not. And this is where we tend to find the fringes between the different classes of stakeholders. In the later chapters, we're going to look about how to not only map out your stakeholders, but in how to use that in order to create an effective strategy and categorize them and create an effective engagement strategy out the back of it. Having too many one-on-ones. Now, this one stems from my previous point about having a default or blanket rule in how you manage all your stakeholders. Now, this is a very common trap that I see all the time. We basically default to having a one-on-one with our stakeholders as our only way to engage and manage our stakeholders. As a result, product managers end up having their calendars full, meetings everywhere, stakeholder one-on-ones and stakeholder meetings, and they have a nightmare of a time trying to manage their time and try and actually get on top of the things that are actually important. So what we're going to do in part of actually creating that engagement strategy in the previous step and tackling that one is I'm going to actually give you some strategies and some techniques in order to basically effectively manage your time and effectively manage your stakeholders. Again, not all stakeholders are created equal, and having a one-on-one for all stakeholders is not the best use of your time. It's not the best use of their time, and there's much more effective ways to do it. It's all about finding out who your stakeholders are, classifying them correctly, how important are they to me, and then being able to employ an effective engagement strategy based on that classification. A simple example of this is that some stakeholders you can keep up to date with a generic forum or even an email or even a Slack message at the end of the week or the end of the month because you don't need to keep them up to date that frequently, and others will need that one-on-one. It's all about identifying it and then employing the right strategy. Another symptom that tends to stem from not identifying the right stakeholders and categorizing them correctly is that we start to neglect the important stakeholders. Now, this neglection can come because we never categorized them in the first place and they've just fallen off our radar, or it's come because we are taking a blanket approach to stakeholder management. And sometimes the blanket approach is not one-on-ones. It's like, I'll keep everybody informed with a monthly stakeholder forum. Now, you're going to have some important stakeholders that are going to need a little bit more than a very broad monthly forum. They're going to want to be involved. They're going to want to have conversations with it, and they want to feel, special, because in a way they're a very important stakeholder to you. So what you need to do is make sure that you are categorizing your stakeholders correctly and making sure that the way that you engage them fits to their level of involvement in the project or your product or your area, and also their importance. The next common trap I see is being too internally focused. So this is super common. Again, things like neglecting customers. We tend not to do that because, as I said, stakeholder tends to be a word we use for internal stakeholders, and customers get treated separately. But we also start to forget things like suppliers and third parties. I see this a lot, and then suddenly they come up and they're such a key component of it all, and we're scrambling and we don't know what to do, and we didn't have a plan in order to communicate to them and engage with them, those types of things. So really important that we're not just focusing internally, we're also looking at that broader spectrum as well. This next one I'm going to talk a lot more about in the later chapters, but it's one of my top stakeholder management techniques, is to understand what keeps your stakeholders up at night. This is a common thing or a common trap that product managers fall into, is not empathizing with their customers enough. They don't spend enough time trying to understand what their stakeholders' concerns are, what their stakeholders see as risks are, and basically to use that in order to build leverage with their stakeholders, but also to be able to address those things. If we don't listen to their concerns and we don't address their concerns, then those concerns fester and they get bigger and bigger. And then that stakeholder becomes really, really challenging, but it's actually just got to do with the fact that they don't feel like they've been heard, they don't feel like they've been listened to, and those really big concerns or those things that they're keeping them up at night aren't being addressed. So they feel like they need to step in order to address them. So again, I'm going to talk about this in depth in the later chapters, and we'll talk about some techniques in order to unearth those concerns, but also to better manage them. This next one I talk about extensively in my first 90 days course about starting a new role and how do you tackle your first 90 days. Because one of the things you need to do in your first 90 days is actually build a very solid foundation in order for trust and rapport to basically flourish from. And so this is something that we spend a lot of time really focused on in our first 90-day course and package. And this is something that you should be laser focused on inside your first 90 days when starting a new job. But equally, it's just as applicable here. Often it stems from not doing it when they first started the job, and over the years, they haven't actually employed it, meaning that they haven't actually tried to build that foundation and that right level of rapport in order for trust to actually be able to flourish from there. Now, this is super important as product people because we know we need to achieve things through others. We need to be able to influence our stakeholders. We also need our stakeholders to trust us and empower us. And whilst we don't have that right foundation, they won't do that. And we will struggle to be successful as a result. So we're going to go into trust. We're going to go into this deeper in the later chapters about how to establish that foundation and how do we actually go about cultivating trust. So when we get to that, we'll definitely be trying to tackle this common trap. This next one is another one we talk about inside the first 90 days package because it is such a common trap and a common point of friction that I see in organizations between all parties, but in particular product managers, because we are those nodes. So what we talk about in it is this concept about communication style. Everyone has a different communication style. Some stakeholders will prefer an email, some will prefer a message, some will prefer a message at the end of the week. Others will want that one-on-one. Some will want the one-on-one to be highly formal, some will want it to be very casual. Now, what you can't control is their preferences. You don't have control over their preferences. But what you do have control over is how you go about managing those preferences, how you go about adapting your style to theirs, or even being able to basically negotiate with them between your preferred style and their preferred style and finding a middle ground. And we're going to touch on this in the later chapters. We're going to have what we call the style conversation, which comes out of the book, The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins. And we're going to basically tackle that at a deeper level about how do you have a style conversation? How do you come up with, understanding what their preferred style is and being able to find that middle ground and that way forwards with adapting your style to theirs. And finally, the last one should really go without saying, but it does happen. It's all about not bringing your stakeholders in early enough. When stakeholders aren't brought in early in the process, friction tends to form later on. And this is because they haven't been part of that journey. They haven't been involved. They don't feel like they've had a say. And as a result, they get unhappy with the direction of the product and where we're actually going. So what we want to do and what we want to avoid is that, and we want to avoid it by bringing them in early in the process. We want to bring them along, have early and frequent engagement and communication with our stakeholders so nothing's a surprise and they feel like they've had a say and they've basically helped shape that direction and they don't feel like they're left out. And it's also not just about being left out, it's also about that crucial context. There's context behind the decisions we made and the direction that we're taking, and it's important that they're part of that and they have that context. So that's really what we want to achieve. We'll talk about this as part of the stakeholder engagement strategy when we start to build that in the later chapters, but that's all designed to avoid this common trap. So that's what we have. We have 9 common traps that I see product managers fall into all the time. First one being to not know who your stakeholders are. Seems fundamental, but it is a common trap. I've asked so many product managers, can you tell me who your stakeholders are? Can you point me to a stakeholder map? There's very little rigor around that, which leads me into the next one about not having a stakeholder engagement strategy, not knowing how to engage that or not being deliberate about how we engage our stakeholders, having too many one-on-ones or just having their calendar full of stakeholder meetings, neglecting those important stakeholders, being too internally focused and forgetting some external stakeholders, having an inadequate understanding and basically management of our stakeholders' concerns and risks, what keeps them up at night, failing to build that right foundation for trust and rapport to happen and to flourish from, misalignment in a communication style, not adapting our style to theirs, and ultimately failing to bring stakeholders in early in the process and frequently. We're going to talk about tackling all of those things in the later chapters. That is basically what this whole course is designed about, is to make you not do those 9 things. So if any of these really resonated with you, you're going to have plenty of tools in order to tackle that.